Okay, this was the day I received, after over a month of waiting, a shipment from the Guangzhou, kind of the mainland Chinese area around Hong Kong. This MSI, which is MicroStar International MPG Z390 Gaming Edge AC motherboard, brand new. This one I got for about $209 plus taxes. Came out to about 233, or was it 238, something like that. I really wanted the ASRock Phantom Gaming Edge ITX, but I had a ASRock motherboard, but it was not working, so I returned it. I've had bad luck with used motherboards in general, and so because of the inability to RMA the motherboard when it goes bad, I think getting a used motherboard is not a good idea. Statistically, apparently, the motherboard is the most likely component of your computer to go bad because it's so complicated. There's so many things on it, so many things that can go wrong on it. And so I think getting a used one is probably not a good idea. It might be that getting this from China via eBay was not a good idea either, because one of the requirements for RMA is to include an invoice. I'm not quite sure if they'll accept this eBay invoice, even though it's apparently a new motherboard. Hopefully I won't need to find that out, but ideally, if you need a motherboard, you should get it brand new in the year that it's introduced, or a year or two or so, from a reputable dealer such as Newegg or Amazon even. And that's what I've done almost all the time, except for just a few instances. As you can see, the package that comes with this MSI product is pretty complete, including registering it. I don't know that registering it makes a big difference beyond them having your information to market stuff at you and sell your information to third parties. So I think you're better off not registering it, but just keeping an invoice copy and such. So I'm just kind of looking over to get a general idea of what this motherboard can and cannot do. One of the criteria I set before I bought a Z390 motherboard, the Z390, because I wanted full support, including overclockability for my i9 9900K CPU, which overclocks to about 5,000 to 5,100 megahertz on my ASUS Z390 full-size ATX motherboard. So I wanted that capability in this ITX format as well. This one promised to be able to do that. Apparently had decent VRM and heat dissipation management with aluminum fins, as you can see. It also critically has 2 slots, including NVMe support. There's one in the front, and I plan to put my Samsung 970 Evo Plus on that one. I had I think a 1 terabyte one that I could use as a boot drive. It has excellent DRAM caching ability and such. And I wanted to put my newly compensated, reimbursed, unfortunately QLC, but still 1 terabyte crucial P2 NVMe drive on the back of the motherboard. I think both of it can use the 4 times lanes, PCIe Express lanes. Also, as you can see, it has a Wi-Fi and Bluetooth chip on it. It's good to have Wi-Fi capability because you never know when, especially for an ITX computer like the NCase M1, which is quite portable, that you're not quite sure where you end up putting it. And you need that, and you want that Wi-Fi capability, as you can see there. And also on that card is Bluetooth. Bluetooth is critical for using, let's say, earphones and headphones and things like that, as well as various mice, keyboards with Bluetooth capabilities. Gives you that extra flexibility. The other criteria I had for the motherboard was that it have iGPU and an integrated GPU, so that you can potentially use more than 4 monitors on this motherboard. Not that you should use more than 4, but the typical motherboard, as you can see, have the typical GPU tend to have 3 display port and HDMI. This 2080 Ti, which is a fairly premium EVGA XC2 Ultra, also has USB-C, which supposedly can give you a 5th monitor output, but I've never tried that. It's hard to find a decently priced monitor nowadays that have USB-C inputs on it, so I haven't been able to try that on any of my monitors yet. So I found that the integrated GPU from the motherboard is excellent for driving at least 1 additional monitor. Sometimes it'll use up to 40% of that capability that's designated for it, but I think that means that potentially you could drive 2 monitors out of it. So anyway, those are some of the reasons why I chose the MSI MPG Gaming Edge Z390i ITX motherboard. The price was steep, $233 shipped from China. So you can find these in the US as well, but they're priced even higher. If I had purchased this motherboard in the year or 2 that it came out, probably could have gotten it for below 200. Probably could have gotten it for maybe 150 or so, 160 maybe. I think the MSRP is probably below 200, but now that the 9900 chipset is a bit out of date, 2 years out of date or so, the motherboards are just, the ITX motherboards for them are going through the roof. So here I am uninstalling the components that are installed on my ASUS Z390i ATX motherboard, which I have in this nifty open rack system. This open rack system is excellent for just general use. The downsides of open rack are that it's of course louder, it attracts dust, and I have a cat roaming around our house sometimes, and I worry that it will attack it while it's in use. So if I'm going to use an open rack, I would put it like in my bedroom where the cat can't access it easily. And one of the upsides of having this open rack was last month when I had a motherboard fire on this very motherboard that I sent into ASUS. I could see it right away. I could smell it. I could smell the burning plastic, and I saw the sparks and flames. I was able to catch that. And I worry what would have happened if it had been inside of a closed system, and I wouldn't have seen the sparks and flames and such. I've been totally clueless as to what happened, just that it had shut down. Here I am installing or uninstalling the Crucial P2 and the Samsung 970 EVO out of this ASUS motherboard, and then putting this aluminum heat shield, heavy aluminum heat shield, back onto it. What I eventually did was I installed my 4770K Haswell Intel chip from, when was that? It's almost 10 years ago, into this into this open rack system, because that CPU was already installed on my ASUS H97i Plus, which had been running incredibly smoothly for at least over a year on inside my NCase M1. So I installed that baby motherboard onto this open rack, along with the FSP Dagger PSU and I think it was maybe just a 500 gigabyte Samsung H97i EVO 2.5 form factor, 2.5 inch form factor SSD onto this open rack, and I'm running it in my bedroom as kind of a HT PC, home theater PC system for our bedroom television set. Now that Haswell chip has been unbelievably stable, smooth, extremely useful chip. Unfortunately, it will never be maintained anymore, as Windows have already given up on it. They're not going to issue like the Windows 11 capabilities onto it anytime soon, apparently, as an example of how that chip is kind of being phased out by computer companies. It has been a smooth and beautifully stable chip for me in various systems that I've used for years now. It does struggle a bit with video rendering, especially like with DaVinci Resolve 17, for instance, and with Cyberlink Power Director, which I use. But I elected to keep this NZXT Kraken X53 280 all-in-one cooler on this open rack, along with the FSP Dagger 650 watt PSU, and on the ASUS H97i Plus, carrying the Intel i7 4770K CPU. It's HyperX, 16 gigabytes of RAM, and the Samsung EVO 860 SSD. And I think that system will work for me very well for years as my bedroom HT PC. Now I do have a couple of ITX cases in the attic that I could fit all that into, like the Fractal Core 500, which is a nice cubic little system, but it's a little bit wide for the stand table that I have it on in the bedroom. So I think this one will work out better. And here, just trying to get the thumb screws out of the adapters for the Kraken X53. I just have a little bit of experience with all-in-ones. The Corsair Arctic freezer, and this one. I'm actually quite impressed with the NZXT Kraken setup. Of the three of them, I think it's the easiest to install. I mean, it's definitely the easiest to install among the three of them. So, as far as ease of installation, as well as just sleekness of looks, I'd recommend the NZXT all-in-ones over all of them. In terms of cooling and capability, I'd have to recommend, as do most people, the Arctic Freezer Liquid Freezer 2, because it's got that quirky VRM cooling fan right on the head. It also has that cachet of German engineering to it, but it is definitely the clunkiest one to install. So here you see the nice copper contact on the NZXT Kraken head. So the NZXT is very competitively priced and really nice setup. I got this one used, this Kraken one, but if I were to buy new, I'd get those ones that are quite a bit more expensive, but can tell you on the head the CPU temperature. This would be especially useful for cases with glass fronts, tempered glass fronts, so you can on site look at your CPU temperature. I don't necessarily need that because I have a 5-monitor setup, and on my overhead monitor I keep open always the CPU ID HW monitor, on which I can see my CPU temperatures on all, like for my 12900 setup, I can see the temperatures on all 16 cores, as well as the clock speeds and the GPU usage, fan speeds, all that. So it's quite a bit more useful than just having, CPU percentage used and temperature on the NZXT head. So I guess that's a bit of a gimmick, in fact, and probably not worth paying that extra premium for it. So I think this standard Kraken X53 is adequate. It's good enough. It's probably the wise choice over paying that $50 extra or whatever for a CPU temperature LCD reveal. And so you see in the mid foreground my Samsung 970 EVO Plus and the Crucial P2, each 1 terabyte. My first experience with NVMe disks came with this motherboard, in fact, and that was 2018. December 2018 was my first try and change over to NVMe or the M2 format disks, and I was actually quite disappointed because, I mean, for one thing, I bought a SATA M2, the Samsung, and the speeds on that are no faster than the 2.5-inch format SSDs. So its only advantage was being tucked away on the motherboard and not taking up space, no cables. So I guess those are good reasons to use it over 2.5-inch, but it was quite fiddly to set up. I guess the motherboard, BIOS, and all that hadn't quite caught up with that technology, and ASUS made it extremely sketchy, extremely clunky to install it. You had to do it from the BIOS system, and it wasn't clear-cut the instructions on how to do it just right. It was kind of overly complicated. Nowadays, it seems to be kind of a default setup that when you plug in your NVMe or even the M2 SATA chips, it just gets recognized immediately. And then you can just use your Windows disk management to initialize and install it. so no longer a problem. The prices on these M2 formats are shockingly similar now to the 2.5 inch format. You don't really get much of a bargain by going to 2.5 inch format SSDs. And so, unless you get some unusual deal that's on a Black Friday sale or whatever on a 2.5 inch format, I don't know that you can make an argument to go for that over these NVMe, especially with the new like the Z390 motherboard. The one I bought from Gigabyte has 4 M2 slots, and the M2 format chips come in volumes as large as 8 terabytes now. So if you just wait for the prices on the 8 terabyte to fall below let's say $100 per terabyte, that's the way to go over SSDs. The biggest problem with SSDs is the connector, the SATA connector and the power connector are very fragile bits of plastic, and when you chip it off, there's not a good way to repair it. You essentially have to like buy a new case or something, because I don't think anybody online or anywhere sells just that port or a piece of the port. And the port is not detachable, so if it cracks off, which it frequently does, you have to epoxy it back on without compromising the connectability. And so that's a big problem with the plastic ports on 2.5 inch format SSDs. Whenever possible, I would definitely recommend here and now in the year 2022 to pretty much only go for the M2 format chips, unless you need massive volumes. And if you do, you should probably get one of those like Ultrastar Western Digital helium packed massive capacity disks. Like I have 2 of the 18 terabyte ones. They have the 20 terabyte ones, but I couldn't find anyone on sale. If there were, I would have gone for that one instead, because 20 terabytes should yield you something like I don't know, like 17 or was it? Oh, let me just see. Gigabytes don't translate to actual volume usable. So the 20 terabyte ones, they apparently came out in November of 2021 according to this Tom's Hardware article. They were to be priced at around $680, but I haven't seen them around anywhere. And we're now, what, 3 months since that article. So yeah, so let's see, what am I doing here? Still trying to take down the components out of this open frame ASUS Z390i motherboard. Except for the initial fiddliness of the NVMe chips, which I eventually got working on it, this had been an extremely solid motherboard. The only problem I could say on it is that it never drove or overclocked my 9900 CPU to more than like around 5002 megahertz. Whenever it hit 5100 megahertz, the system became extremely unstable and would blue screen predictably within like a day or two. So I had to keep the overclock just at around 5000 megahertz, which was adequate. for most things. And at 5,000, it was extremely stable. It would stay up for like 2 weeks before needing a reset, reboot. I mean, usually it would need a reboot prior to that because of various updates to systems. But this ASUS 9900K, they came back from ASUS headquarters after repair of, I assume, the SATA ports and whatever burn streaks that occurred from that motherboard fire. I presume from the power supply, but I'm not sure what it was from entirely. But I'm just going to keep it in the attic in case I want to reinstall the 9900K onto this open rack or some other system. I might sell it, but it could be a hard sell knowing that it was a repaired unit, refurbished unit from ASUS. I'd have to tell the buyer that that was the case, and that's likely to drop the price on it dramatically, much more than what the value of the motherboard actually is, because now that I know that it works perfectly, it's as good as a brand new motherboard to me. But someone who might buy it, they would never pay the going price on it, given its history. I feel that I'd have to give the given history of it to whatever seller might want to buy it. So I'm going to just end up keeping it in the attic for now. Now those Z390i ASUS motherboards, the ROG Strix motherboards, go for sale on eBay and such, on Reddit, places like that, for I think around a couple $100. Or at least maybe $150 to a couple $100. So that's my open rack, aluminum rack going. Very useful setup. I mean, if I were to have a single computer system, let's say I'm in a dorm or an apartment living by myself, you can make a very strong argument to just go for an open rack like that instead of a case. Especially if you don't have pets or roommates or anything like that who could damage it, because it's really nice to look at, to see all your components up front, right in front of your right in your face, and you can see what's working, what's not working. You can replace, you can maintain so easily. So the open rack is quite a good setup. And here's my NCase M1. This is I think version 2. I have a black NCase M1 version 1, I believe. No, I believe this one is version 6, and I have another version 6, a black one. Yeah, version 6.1. I have a version 6.0, I think, a black one, but I put a Ryzen 3700X into that one, along with a 2080 Founders Edition GPU. And I set that up for my daughter. It's got 4 terabytes of 2.5-inch SSD and 2 NVMe chips in it. So it's got lots of storage on it. These NCase M1 will no longer be made by the subsidiary of, I guess, Lian Li, or who own it now, I believe. And these were some of the most beautiful ITX cases, one of the first ITX cases. And so the whole thing just comes apart beautifully. It's just, I mean, it's like a Rector set come to life with far-reaching practical aspects to it. I mean, you can install just about anything you'd want to install in this system. I've tried the NZXT Kraken 280 AIO into it. Everything crams in, and the thermals are like perfect. But my favorite cooler for this system is what what you see in front of me. This Noctua C14S, and I think some others have shown as well that it works best in this format with the fans pushing the air downwards onto the motherboard. Now I've installed the slim or the thin 120 fan on top of it to push more air down into the motherboard or augment it. And for that, it works adequate. It doesn't have a good tie-down system for it, so I'm using zip ties, as you can see, so it's kind of messy but functional. That's the most important thing. So, I mean, I'm not very good at cable management, and to be honest, I don't really give a crap that much about what it all looks like, as long as it's out of the way, so that it doesn't interfere with fans or cooling or things like that. So I'm mainly just into the function of it, and just crinkling up the cables, as you see here, for me is good enough. And I don't have a clear tempered glass screen on it, so it's not like you can see it anyway. So this aluminum case is just supreme. The NR200 has certain benefits, but one of the benefits it does not have is over the NcaseM1 is the beauty in the metal engineering of it. Just look at how all the edges and corners come together so beautifully. It's like art. I don't mind it all banged up the way it is now. It kind of gives it this kind of cyberpunk feel to it, to have it all banged up, dinged up like that. And I like it like that. So, you know, I have a good 150mm screwdriver, EVGA screwdriver. I'm just trying out this kind of. I ordered a set of 150mm steel bit sets like this, so I'm just trying it out here. As you can see, it doesn't work that great. I also have one of those 150mm I think a number 2 Phillips screwdriver that came for free with my Scythe Mugen 5 cooler. That's a great deal. It's almost worth getting one of those coolers just for that screwdriver, because it's an outstanding screwdriver. I have that one upstairs in the bedroom. I use it all the time to maintain the 3 computers I have in my bedroom. So far my wife has tolerated that, but she's eventually going to kick me out of the house for all these computers I have at home. I have like something like 8 or 9 desktop computers at home now. The way it accumulates is insidious and kind of hard to avoid. You know, you start off with buying all new components or whatever components for a system. You know, for me that was the first computer I built from individual components dates back to around 2000, the year 2000. Prior to that, I just went with Dell, kind of off-the-shelf Dell computers. I mean, it was those Dell setups where you get on their website and you can pick and choose the components onto it, and they deliver it to you in good shape usually. It generally works, but the parts were kind of proprietary, so you couldn't swap out components so easily on the Dell systems. But around 2000 I started buying individual components, which are more flexible, tend to be superior components, are replaceable, tend to be cheaper than the Dell off-the-shelf products that you can customize. And so after I first built one component by component, I think that must have been around 2005 or so, was the first one I built component by component. I have many of those components in the attic still. Like those ancient, kind of useless GPUs. What was it, like Radeon HD 4800 system GPUs, things like that. Zalman copper coolers, stuff like that. I still have in the attic. I couldn't sell it for any kind of money at this point, because who would buy them? So just keep it as like a memento until my wife will make me get rid of it. A lot of those systems, surprisingly, you can still use. Like I tried putting together those old systems again, and they still run, shockingly. Extremely slow, not very practical. Slower than a laptop, than like a cheap laptop now. But here, I finally cracked out the C14S. You see the thermal paste smothering the contact points, removing the thumb screws, the adapters for, what is this, the 1200? System of the motherboard. You unplug all the cable, the CPU cable and such. There's the HD audio cable coming out. As far as tools are concerned, I highly recommend these Japanese engineer tools. They are fantastic. I think superior to like the Knipex versions from Germany, mainly because it's got these rubberized, comfortable grips, extremely tight tolerances, really high quality tools from Japan. They're called Engineering is the brand name. So here is my messy 4770 CPU setup, almost ready to come out. I'm just doing some battery changes here on the overhead cam. I'm just using the slotted screwdriver from this Klein screwdriver to push down the little indenter of the power supply cable. I'm like 55, well, I'll be 55 years old this year, so my eyes went very bad for nearsightedness. So I'm a combination of nearsighted and farsighted. This is what they call presbyopia. Your eyes go bad for short distances, and you can no longer look at something from like 2 inches, 4 inches the way you can when you're like a baby. Your nearsighted capability, your near vision capability tend to be intact through your 30s, usually till your 40s to 45 in most people, and then you start noticing that you can't see things up close. Like for instance, you can't tell time on your watch unless you remove your glasses and look at it with your bare eyes, or a lot of people will use reading glasses for the purpose of looking at near vision items. It's very concerning, very disturbing when this starts happening in your 40s. So a lot of times people will start looking at reading glasses and carry that around their necks and stuff. I did try bifocals. Those are those glasses where you have, so the equivalent of reading glasses, or these bifocal cutouts at the bottom of your lens. And that works fine if you get used to it, but it removes that bit of vision from your whole field, which is not good for like when you're driving, right? It's horrible. You can't use it for driving. It's not safe, in fact, because that's in the way. You can't look at your gauges, your odometer and such while you're driving. So bifocals can't be used for driving. You have to use just regular glasses and just give up the capability of, or the potential needing to look at something up close, like looking at your watch while you're driving. And more importantly, now that we have smartphones, when you hold up your smartphone, you need your near vision to look at messages and text and whatever, right, to make a phone call. So bifocals can be used for that, but it can't be used for driving. So what can you do? Well, the solution is progressive lenses, which is what me and my wife use. I mean, you'll hear of many people telling you, "Oh, don't use that. It'll make you dizzy, and it's just kind of dizzying and unusable." But absolutely not true. Progressive lenses are what everybody should get used to. What happens is when you first put it on, yeah, you're dizzy. You don't know what to make of it, but you have to just keep it on and keep using it every day for at least a week or two. And what happens is your visual cortex, your bilateral visual cortex, right and left brain, will grow to accept and learn how to adjust your eyes focal length is going from far to near, and it becomes essentially very similar to just fixing your near vision problem, your presbyopia. So progressive lenses used to be thousands of dollars 10 plus years ago, but now you can get these lenses from places like iBuy Direct or Coastal. You can get them for like $100, $150 a pair. And with a coupon, you can get it for like $60 a pair, which is what I did. And this was maybe 3-4 years ago that me and my wife just tried it, because we saw a sale for about $65 a pair. So we said, oh, we lose like $150 if we buy 2 of them. We tried it for 2 weeks. Now they are indispensable, and it's as if our presbyopia has disappeared. I recommend it severely for everybody, any old person, any boomer, basically, anybody over 40. So here I'm finally untangling the cobra's nest of cables. Now, what I hate about these SFX format power supplies are that they generally, I mean, this includes for the most premium PSUs, so like the FSPs, the Super Flowers, what's the name of the best power supply that you can buy? Seasonic. Even for Seasonic, they provide these thick, unyielding PVC coated wires and cables for the PSU. It's only Corsair who has the foresight and the wisdom to provide those kind of cloth covered thin format cable, which are absolutely critical for these tight ITX builds. So it's one of the failings of most PSU providers. And you end up having to, if you're really serious about very tiny format ITX cases, you end up having to purchase custom cabling for an additional a couple $100 sometimes, because these manufacturers provide these stupidly thick PVC coated cables like this. It's absolutely unmanageable. And I guess the advantage of these are that it's so sturdy, like undamageable. So like if you caught a spark or something, or accidentally cut into something, it's less likely to be damaged. I guess that's the benefit of it. But I think most people would prefer much more of the kind of nylon covered cable, the thin cables that Corsair Platinum versions come with, for instance. And it's worth that extra premium to pay for the Corsair Platinum just for that. Now you can look into building your own cables, which is pretty easy to do, I guess, but it's kind of tedious and actually a bit of an investment that you may not recoup, because A, you have to buy a lot of nylon sleeving, a lot of cables and connectors to just build one set, and it's not economical to build one set because they usually come in multiples, the adapters and such that you have to buy in a package from all the way from China. So it's kind of hassle to put a kit together. Once you have it together, you can measure stuff out exactly and build it exactly the way you want it. And I guess it's its own hobby, and I can see the attraction of doing it. But I think most people with a little bit of cash will opt to let specialists just build it for them and just pay the money for it, $100 or whatever. But again, those custom cables become almost the price of a PSU, which is ridiculous if you think about it. So here I'm using methanol, rubbing alcohol, to wipe off cleanly the residual thermal paste off of the Noctua C14S contact points. You could just use the old paste as long as it's not too old, but these thermal pastes do play a role in cooling, and at least psychologically you like to have the idea that, oh, if I decide not to go back into it, it could last me 3, 4, 5 years. And so putting in new thermal paste is valuable for that kind of comfort level, the ease of mind of doing it that way. So what I saw online in terms of testing was that the C14S was pretty much 95% or so the equal of using a D15S for cooling the 9900K, so, or at least 90% of it. So because it cools the 9900K so well, I thought it would be a much better choice in the NcaseM1 than using an all-in-one, which makes the case extremely cramped, restricts the airflow of everything else extremely as well, and also blocks the view of the computer and its components almost completely. So like I have a Loki Ghost S1 system with a Corsair all-in-one. Now that one doesn't come with any kind of viewing window or viewability of the innards, so I didn't care as much that an all-in-one basically covered up everything, because the main selling point of the Loki Ghost S1 is that it's so compact, and it is. It's just a compact hunk of metal once you put it together. So an all-in-one works perfectly for it. Actually, an all-in-one is almost mandatory in the Ghost S1 because it's so tiny and so airflow restrictive that if you try to use a tower cooler of any type or even a blow-down cooler, it really heats up. So here I'm installing the P2 Crucial 1 terabyte into the back of the MSI motherboard. if you look at all the data on whether to cool and what parts of the M2 chip to cool with using a heatsink or not, you see some people saying, oh, it doesn't matter. But I like the ease of mind of at least putting a little hunk of metal on it to cool it down in those brief bursts when it could potentially really heat up and potentially burn out or damage the chip, and more importantly potentially damage the data, which could be crucial data that you've put into it. And so I thought it's worth the trouble to put a really good heatsink on it. And so here I'm trying this flimsy XPS strip of aluminum that came with my, my XPG strip that came with my XPG ADATA 4 terabyte NVMe that I had installed in my main system. It may not do a significant much compared to nothing, but more for peace of mind. One of the things with the ITX systems, ITX motherboards, is that since it only comes with 2 slots of RAM, you have to be careful that you have enough RAM memory to stick on it. In this setup, I'll only be able to put 16 gigabytes of RAM on it, whereas my preference would be at least 32 gigabytes. It seems to make a difference in daily use with various operators and programs. You know, Adobe Lightroom, DaVinci Resolve, Cyberlink Power Director, spreadsheets, Word, moving large documents, whatever, opening up multiple tabs on your browser. It seems to make a big difference. So I would have preferred that these were 16 gigabyte sticks and that I have 32 gigabytes on it, but generally should be usable. It's rare that I would go over 16 gigabytes of RAM usage, but in my typical use scenario, for instance, when I'm working on my main window and I have like, I don't know, 40 windows open. I've got my security Reolink system, PC client open, and I'm recording something or rendering or whatever. I'm commonly going over 16 gigabytes of RAM in that daily use scenario. I remember many years ago, maybe even 5-6 years ago, I would have been one of the people who would say, you just need one 32-inch monitor in front of you. You don't need multiple screens. I would be one of the people to say that's kind of a decadent setup to have more than one monitor in front of you. But what I found is that when you have it, and once you get used to using multiple monitors, you can never go back. So, for instance, in a typical use scenario, I'm talking like a non-gamer scenario, non-frivolous scenario. Let's say you're doing taxes, right? Ideally, for working on detailed documents that can involve resizing Word documents or text or number documents to the size that you like to see. You know, in your main window in front of you, let's say I have a 32-inch 4K monitor, which is ideal for managing documents and spreadsheets and whatever, numbers, because you can resize a spreadsheet such that the numbers become very, very small. On a 4K screen, despite it being microscopic almost in size, you can make out the numbers when it's 4K. It's still crisp enough. There is a difference compared to, let's say, 1440K, 1440p. So in your main window, you might have your TurboTax or whatever open, or let's say a spreadsheet open right in front of you. Now I have a second 4K monitor to my left, which is my LG GN950. And most people would say, oh, you don't need two 4K monitors, but sometimes I like to have a bunch of documents open on that monitor, also resized to very small lettering and numbers. And so let's say you've got like a Windows Explorer open on my monitor to my left with multiple receipts open, and let's say even a spreadsheet open there. And I don't want to close them, I just want to keep them open for ease of data entry into TurboTax or whatever. Now that's two monitors being used, right? But now let's say you want another monitor open, another window open, because you're doing some research on some IRS documents, and so you have a window open and you're perusing IRS documents on that window. And then let's say you split screen on a monitor above you so that you have another monitor open, another window next to it with, let's say, a forum where CPAs are asked various questions. So you've got that, review screen above you, as well as the TurboTax and whatever else in front of you. You've got receipts and Windows Explorer open to the left of you. Now let's say there is a video that describes some other function or important news regarding that taxation events and review of taxation events, or even a podcast. Now you want another monitor to open that up so that the monitors in front of you don't get excessively cramped. Now now you need your fourth monitor to your left and above. So I would open that one up on the monitor to my left and above my 4K monitor. And that's an easy 4-monitor scenario that you can envision that most people may encounter annually in their tax work even. But let's say you work, let's say you write articles and you like to do research, you like to watch videos and documentaries while working on your main screen, typing away or doing spreadsheets or whatever. And that's a very common scenario where you would want 4 monitors up. Because if you had a cascading series of windows just on one monitor in front of you, now it gets very inconvenient to kind of click through and search through those monitors to see which screen you want up, because you can't have too many browsers up open in front of you, right? Because then each one gets exceedingly small. And so in my mind, having 2 monitors is minimum amount of monitors you need. Having 3 is great. Having 4 is very practical. And having a 5th one, I like to have one open on my right for entertainment purposes. Watching a movie, watching, whatever, NVideo or Odyssey videos up and such. And so that's why I have multiple monitors up, and that's my argument for having multiple monitors. If you can afford it and you have the space to do it, there's absolutely no reason not to have more than 3, 4, 5 monitors up. If you could have 6 monitors up, do it if it's practical and useful for you, because it will dramatically increase your productivity. So I'm just going to try the fitting of the C14S onto the motherboard now. Funny thing is, you can't really know in which orientation the C14S will go in your ITX box until you try it. Sometimes there's there are points where it can hang up on you and you just can't make it fit and you have to flip it around. In this situation, looks like I'll be able to reinstall in the same orientation that it was before. The memory on the HyperX, I believe, was 3200 megahertz. Dual rank, and so when you see it on your CPU-Z or HW monitor, it comes out at 1600 megahertz as long as you set the XMP in BIOS. If you don't set the XMP in BIOS, memory will come out like 1066 or something like that, some far lower number. I guess in some situation or in motherboards that don't allow XMP, you'll have to use the slower speed of the resident RAM, but I haven't run across that situation because generally I've always bought fairly name brand motherboards. This is actually only my second experience with MSI motherboards. The other MSI motherboard I had is a B450 for a Ryzen system, and that motherboard was a bit flaky. It was supposed to be pretty steady. It actually is running steady now, but when I first got the Ryzen chip for it, it wasn't doing that great. That was also an ITX MSI motherboard I had. I think it had to do with either BIOS or something like that. It could have been a firmware issue on the GPU or something that made the board kind of flake out. Like for instance, it would lose Bluetooth connections and intermittently and unexpectedly, which is kind of a pain. And then every time the GPU, oh, by the way, I had a 5700 XT GPU on it, Radeon GPU, and it would flake out. And so I never pinned down what the problem was, whether it was GPU firmware, which is the meme that was going around the forums, or whether it was BIOS. So I updated the BIOS every time a new one came out, thinking that generally when they introduce a stable BIOS or a new BIOS, they will have incorporated into it most of the error fixes in the previous BIOS. I mean, the mistakes, problems that crop up tend to occur with various updates in other components or other aspects. Let's say in the browser, as websites update this and that, sometimes the browser doesn't keep up. You have to update the browser, and same thing goes on along down the line, down to actual hardware components. So I like to try to keep everything updated as much as possible, because you do always have the option of kind of downgrading or going back if it doesn't work well. I like to set a restore point prior to any of those things happening. But this is another reason why I like to install my personal data. I mean, things like documents or vids, images, whatever, on a separate disk from my boot disk, my C disk. So on the C disk, I'll tend to just install programs, various, what do you call it, firmware upgrades and application data and things like that on the main boot drive. So the reason I like to keep the boot drive voluminous in capability, I like to try to use 2 terabytes nowadays as much as possible, is that sometimes I like to use the boot drive as like a scratch disk for image manipulation and video manipulation, because that little extra boost in speed for rendering, transferring of files, and this and that makes a big difference. And so I like to try to use the main boot drive, which I'll usually spend the most money on, as both the place to store all the applications and firmware, BIOS, whatever, upgrades, as well as a kind of a scratch disk for files that require high speed, like video and imaging. So other than that, I'll try to move everything off to my side disks. Like in this instance, I'll be using that Crucial P2, which is a crappy QLC M2 chip, but I'll try to use that as my storage place. Mainly because since it'll slow down massively in large file transfers, I'm thinking that won't happen too much. I won't be transferring files, huge files to it too much. It'll tend to be kind of a gradual accumulation of files type of issue. Now here I'm using the NcaseM2 support bracket. I'm fitting it onto my Corsair SF750 Platinum so that I can install it onto the back of the case. And you have a couple of options on how to mount the PSU, but I like to mount it this way, kind of fat side vertically, so that it gives me an extra, like a cube or a rectangle of room in front of it, in case in the future I want to mount, let's say, a 3.5 fat, old-timey hard drive on it, or a couple of them even, or even 2.5 inch SSDs. It gives you a little bit of room to do that. This is also the orientation that would allow me to, if I want to switch to an all-in-one cooler, this orientation allows me to install that towards the front. It kind of crunches in all the cables between it. You have to install a grate over the fan. You have to install a grate over the fan so that the cabling doesn't rattle against the fan accidentally. So as you can see, the open rack construction of the NcaseM1 skeleton allows clear view access from every side. One of the great options for the NcaseM1 that I've used for my daughter's NcaseM1 setup is, you see that very front? You can install a slotted DVD, Blu-ray, CD, reader, writer right into it. A really nifty little thing to do that will turn this box into an entertainment system that allows you to use your vintage CDs and DVDs, Blu-rays, whatever. Nowadays, the Zoomers and YGens seem to have completely abandoned CD, DVD, Blu-rays in favor of streaming, or even just MP4 files or whatever, MP3 files. But I remember back in 1982, 1983, I purchased one of the earliest Sony Discmans, which was a sleek black square only about an inch or so high, but extraordinarily expensive. I recall something in the neighborhood of $400 or so, which back in 1983 was a huge amount of money. But I spent it to purchase that Sony Discman. I forget the number, what model that was, but it had made this kind of futuristic zipping sound when you put a CD into it. When you turned it on, you would hear that zipping sound. You see like reflections of the red laser, and then you see the disc spinning, and it was just magical experience, a magical sense that the future was here. It worked very well as well. The sound was extraordinarily clean and consistent, unlike cassette tapes or vinyl record albums, which I'd used prior to then. It just blew away the experience of listening to music compared to the vinyl and 8-track or cassette methods that we were used to prior to then. Cassette tapes, which used those kind of how wide were they? Maybe 2-3 millimeter wide, fragile, like tape, basically, which could snap and warp. For instance, if you carried your cassette in your car, which many of us did, don't be shocked if after a hot summer all your cassettes are warped. So if you don't have the foresight to remove all your cassette tapes when you leave your car, or you don't have some kind of system that allows you to do that, at some point when you try to listen to your cassettes again, they don't work because they had melted together, or best case, the tape was warped beyond listenability, and so when you hear this kind of warping kind of sound. It absolutely destroys your listening experience. So the cassettes, which seemed to be kind of futuristic when they first came out in the 70s, in the late 70s, sometime after the 8-track tape, which is kind of a large, fat, clunky version of the initial version of the tape, reel-to-reel mini tape experience. Cassettes seem so much better than 8-tracks or reel-to-reel, but they had that problem of warping and heat. The majority of your portable listening experience were by cassette tapes by the late 70s until the CDs arrived. Now, record albums, what we call record albums, what they call vinyl now, or LPs, long play albums, which were, I believe, about 12 inches or so in diameter, also warped under various conditions, under heat, under weight, if something was pressing on it or something like that, or temperature changes. Sometimes they just came warped. I remember back in 1978, I bought a Miko Star Wars album. When you pulled it out, it was magically kind of red. I remember it being kind of red color, plastic. And when I pulled it out, it was warped. So if you spun it, the album would kind of do a wave on your turntable. I mean, it played fine, but sometimes they just come that way. I guess from either factory heat or cheap pressing or whatever. But sometimes very high quality vinyl can sound nice and warm and staticky. I understand that idea that people have, but I believe most of it is kind of psychological. The sound in itself is no more warmer or brighter or better than cassette or CD. CD is far superior, especially on a well audio engineered recording, like some of those 70s Telarc recordings. Sparkling, pure sound. Nowadays, you can get sound much better than that from MP3 formats with lossless audio. But sometimes, when the sound is just too, what do you call it, transparent, you also can hear too much adventitious noise and sounds in it, and that's the disadvantage of digital, is that you can sometimes hear too much. Whereas in the old days, you hear that scratching, kind of distorted sound of time and degradation and erosion on the recording every time you hear it. And it's not always a bad thing to hear. But in any case, I forgot how I went off on that digression. I guess I was talking about motherboard and CD. Oh yeah, I was talking about ODD, the slot-in ODD component that you can put into these NcaseM M1 cases. Anyway, that's why I do enjoy putting in an ODD slot into my computers whenever I can, because I have a large collection of CDs dating back to the early 1980s that I still own. Some of them kind of dry rotted, or like the aluminum or whatever, the metal of it would drop out in little dots and spots, and the CDs are no longer playable. I assume it's related to just poor manufacturing. It happened to a couple of my very expensive CDs too. Back in the early 80s, one CD would cost something in the range of $20 to $25. And I bought a couple of hundred CDs at that price in the early 80s, because unfortunately I early adopted it relatively compared to most people. But listening to CDs makes me reminisce about my early days in college, because that's what I listened to mostly in college, as I studied and did problem sets and whatever. But even I have not listened to an actual CD in years now, perhaps in 6+ years now, because it's kind of pointless. The sound is no better than just listening to MP3s. Also, significantly, I've lost hearing on my right ear, 80% loss of hearing on my right. So I just have my one left ear to listen to, and so high fidelity audio is no longer a thing for me. It's not something worth wasting any money on. 'Cause I mean, I might as well just be listening to scratchy, distorted sound. But psychometrically, the majority of sound that you hear is from your brain. So when you are listening to something, you are constructing the sound using your cranial nerve 8 partially, but I think a large component is your auditory cortex in your brain. And so that's why sometimes when you're dreaming or when you're imagining, you can hear almost everything, reconstruct the sound of any piece in your brain without even listening to it. The more you think about it like that, it seems foolhardy to put a lot of money into audio equipment, into headphones, earphones, amplifiers, speakers, but I know that's a hobby of enjoyment, so you don't want to crush people's dreams related to that too much. Which reminds me, This MicroStar International MPG Gaming Edge 390 Z390i motherboard comes with a Realtek ALC 892 codec audio, and to my ear, and to my crippled ear, the generic Realtek sound is beyond adequate. It exceeds the range of my hearing, exceeds the range of my discernibility of distortion or anything like that. And so technology when it comes to audio has exceeded my ability to perceive variances or differences in it. So I don't really worry myself about that part of it too much. I can imagine there are younger people with far better hearing than me who might pay more attention to that and who would put in like an external, adapter, external series of audio components to alter or improve and clean up the sound, at least the DAC, digital audio converter, a digital analog converter with an amplifier for headphones or whatever. I see a lot of kids doing that, and if you can hear the difference, I don't see a reason not to do that. But for me, it's beyond superfluous. It's useless because I can't hear any difference. I can hear volume. I can hear that's louder, but to me, it doesn't sound any cleaner or better in any way. I mean, certainly, you can change features like bass, treble, mids, whatever, but I can do that just on a regular computer as well. So what else is about this build? Yeah, the Noctua fans. So certainly Noctua fans are engineered to a far greater degree. So they're built and designed in a more superior way than typical fans, but it seems like a lot of other fan companies have caught up to them. So for instance, Arctic P12s, which I own several of, are almost as good, although it has a glaring hole at a certain speed. It will generate like adventitious sounds, a problem that Noctuas don't have. So if you can afford it, you can't blame anyone for buying these ugly Noctua fans. Actually they're not ugly. So that cream brown color of them kind of gives you this kind of warm, nostalgic feeling, because Noctua's been around for like what, 20 years or so, and people like us who've been building computers for that long have been using occasional Noctua fans that you incorporate when you can afford it and or you feel like buying them. Kind of gives you this nice woody feeling. They tend to be noiseless compared to other fans. They tend to be problem-free. They come with great support, the range of adapters, and you can pretty much use them forever. I suspect they're like lifelong usage, or at least one person's life. You see these kind of cut-out holes in the back of the NcaseM1. I've seen lots of people who will put in like a custom cooling system with tubes and reservoirs and all that. I have no interest in messing with any of that because I've seen pictures where people tubing cracks or something bad happens, and then it's just a nightmare.
a bunch of water damage everywhere. Just not worth the trouble, because the additional few degrees centigrade and cooling that it might afford is not so useful for most people, and definitely not for me. I was pretty confident that the C14S blowdown cooler, Noctua cooler, will be adequate to cool the 9900K. Because the D15S that I've been using in my main computer on the 9900K was more than adequate to cool it. I never had any problems with temperature zooming, even over like 80 on it. And occasionally it would hit about 80. Like when I'm all out rendering with a clunky Cyberlink Power Director software, for instance. So here I'm doing just kind of extemporaneous, unplanned, kind of a dodgy job, zip tying cable. Just trying to get it out of the way so that I might be able to put in a couple of external hard disk drives into it if I wanted to in the future. I won't need to do that in this system. This system will go on the desk right behind me to use as my secondary setup, which can be useful when I'm, for instance, rendering a video. If I wanted to render a video behind me and I wanted access to other programs in front of me. Video rendering really uses up lots of a CPU's resources, such that other things can kind of slow down and the whole system can really start heating up. So video rendering, let's say for an item that's like 8 hours long or whatever, can really take a long time as well. And so just letting it run in this system and just setting it, forgetting it, can be convenient. So initially set up the computer behind me for my wife to use, and it's a couple of generations before this computer I'm working on now that I set it up for her that way. But she doesn't like to use that because my wife still works, and so she does a lot of Zoom calling and things like that, communications. So she needs to be away from distractions, namely me, when she does that. So I set up a computer for her upstairs in an office. I set up an office for her upstairs, and she likes that much better. Which leaves the desk and the setup behind me for me to use as my secondary computer, my secondary or accessory system that I use for recording things, using OBS for rendering videos and things like that. It actually can be used for gaming. So you'll see later that I upgraded the triple monitor setup on it. Initially I was just using a single monitor, and then I upgraded it to a 1440p 2K ViewSonic monitor, 27-inch, which works beautifully. But I liked having a couple of other monitors, like I said, to the side of it, because it's very useful. I have to have one monitor set up to view, at least partially, your computer's resource usage. So like I said, the HW monitor lets me see the CPU core temperatures, fan speeds, the clock speeds, the GPU temperatures, utilizations, clock speeds, and fans. It lets me see all that at a glance. I also like to have the Windows 10 task monitor up, so I can see very quickly the graphical interface of utilization, clock speed, things like that, percentage use of RAM, CPU, GPU, hard drives, and all that. So having those two kind of arranged on one monitor is very useful. And then above that, I'll kind of do a half screen of some like a ASMR, like rain video on NVIDIA or something like that, just to have something of interest to see. And then on my third monitor, I'll have my other programs up that I might use as a daily kind of practical thing, emails, calendars, whatever. If I were working on documents, Word documents or whatever, spreadsheets. So it's good to have a third monitor to the side for just practical usage of applications. Meanwhile, on the central monitor, I'll be doing something like video rendering or image manipulation, OBS studio recordings or whatever of some event on Odyssey or whatever, if I wanted to record that. So having that second system behind me is quite useful to me in that way, because while I just do that, set it and forget it, behind me I could be working on my main computer for whatever application or whatever thing I'm doing at the moment. So for instance, while I'm building out this computer, I have in front of me, the manual, the motherboard manual, the cooler manual, whatever else I might need. I may not need most of it, but having that cracked open in front of me allows me to kind of click up and down and refer to it as I need to. And also I might have like a YouTube type of instructional video up for some detailed views I might want to look at, or for some other use case. And in this instance, I'm also recording or looking at something, and I might have some cameras up that I can look at. And on one of the 5 monitors that's in front of me. At the same time, I'll usually have like a video open. Sometimes a podcast, sometimes some music, sometimes some other reference material open in one of the monitors in front of me. That allows me to just move my head and see it at a glance, rather than having to cascade through windows like I said before. And so having this type of setup with many monitors is very, I think, practically useful day to day. And here I am inserting the fan plugs into the CPU ports, making sure that it fits and doesn't interfere or bang into anything, making sure it clears the RAM, making sure it's going to give me room to put in the GPU. It's an extremely tight fit, as you can see. It's kind of cracked to one side because the cabling right over the power supply input port is quite piled up, and I'll have to mash it down without cutting it. These fins can act as knives on these kind of delicate nylon cables. You have to be careful. So one of the joys of ITX building, and one of the challenges to it, is just little things like this. You have to just kind of be very careful and nudge things just a little bit by little bit to make it kind of fit without interfering with fans, without being right on top of some component that's going to get extremely hot and have the risk of burning through it. And also, of course, making sure you don't accidentally choke off or cut off a cable or wire. But once you get it all fitted in, very satisfying to see it up and working. And it takes up so little room. and it so efficiently uses the space allotted for it that as long as you don't mind nipping and tucking little component pieces and cables and ports and wires like this, it's far superior to one of those massive cavernous cases that take up a lot of room in your room, on your desk, or whatever. In the early days, we didn't have all these temperature inputs that we have access to now all over the motherboard. And this temperature output data is quite useful and comforting, because when you see it, you know that everything is working right and you're going to have adequate cooling throughout your system. So with ITX setups like this, in comparison to my main setup, I mean, sure, there's less headroom thermally, but it's still adequate. You know, if you need to, you tweak the fan curve so that it blows a little bit faster than it would in your main system, and it doesn't cause any more problems after that. I mean, you can pretty much choose the temperatures you're comfortable with. Like for GPU, I like to keep it around 40 C. For my CPUs, I like to keep them somewhere in the 40s as well. And so you can do that in these ITX systems. I mean, I'm talking at idle. Under workloads, of course, the ITX systems have the potential of going much higher, but as long as it doesn't exceed the breakdown point, as long as like the temperatures for CPU doesn't exceed like 80 or whatever, or if it does go over 80, as long as it doesn't do that for more than a few seconds, you're gonna be fine. So one of the things I realized with the Alder Lake, my main Alder Lake setup with the 12900, even with 360 millimeter, three fan Arctic liquid freezer 2 setup, during video rendering, for instance, the core temperatures, each core will go up sometimes to 100 degrees Celsius for like a second before plopping back down. Now, it just does that for like a second or two before settling down again, but it does do it on each core. And I don't know of another way to make it cooler. I think the Alder Lake CPUs, I mean, they just do that. I guess if you use like a liquid nitrogen setup, you might be able to prevent that, or I mean, you will be able to prevent that, but I mean, I think that's just the nature of Alder Lake CPUs, that they get really hot like that. On my previous build video, where I showed me trying the Noctua D15S, so the peak temperatures with Noctua D15S was no higher than the peak temperatures with Arctic liquid freezer. The difference was that with the Noctua D15S, the temperatures would just sit on it, would sit on 95 degrees for minutes. And that's what made me nervous. So I'm very happy to have changed out to Arctic liquid freezer, because it bounces high, but then it kind of goes back down. Now here, I'm installing my EVGA 3080 Ti For the Win 3, which I paid a dear price of $1,700 for this past summer, or the previous summer. I mean, I saw most of the pricing kind of stabilize around that point, 1,600 to 1,700. And I wanted a new one, an unopened one, and so I had to pay that extra $100 or so to get a brand new one. And it wasn't even readily available, but I just caught one that I was able to get at that price. Now this exceeds the MSRP of the 3080 Ti, which were supposed to be like $500 cheaper than that. So it's a bit of a rip-off, but that's the nature of the GPU pricing this past year. If I was more patient, I would just like skipped it, stuck with my 2080 Ti for another couple of years or more, and I would have been fine. The increase in performance of the 3080 Ti over the 2080 Ti can be said to be marginal, maybe 20%, maybe 25% sometimes, better than 2080 Ti. What I saw is that when I'm rendering a video, let's say if it's a video that would have taken me 8 hours to render on 2080 Ti, with the 3080 Ti, I can render it in about 6 hours. So is that significant? So that whether it's significant for you is utterly subjective. So what happened is that people worldwide have latched on to the GPUs as a way to gouge, as a way to scalp and make money for themselves. Unfortunately, that happened this past year, this past couple of years. I remember 15 years ago when you can get the leading GPU for $400 or less, $200 to $300 or less sometimes. Of course, the GPUs around then weren't worth anything. They were, they were not that amazing. Whereas this GPU here, the 3080 Ti, can render a smooth 4K image in real time, for instance on like a modern AAA game. So it's kind of satisfying to have a GPU that can pretty much almost keep up with the top of the line GPUs on the market, like the 3090s, 6900 XTs. And compared to those two, it seems like a relative bargain. So it's all perspective. But this 2080 Ti was also overpriced when I bought it. I must have bought this 2080 Ti 3 years ago or something like that. I paid $1,100 for it. No, actually I paid $1,050 for it, shipped. And to me at that time it was like way overpriced, like almost unreasonable for me to have bought one at that price. But it has served me well, and I don't regret paying for it, paying that price for it. because it made an enormous difference in video rendering compared to the 2070, which I had been using prior to then. I subsequently did buy like a 2080 Founders Edition. That one also does very well, but really stuttered and struggled with like 4K, whereas the 2080 Ti pretty much does 4K okay. Just the slightest stuttering every now and then. So the 2080 Ti is ideally, I think, suited for like 2K imaging, maybe not quite 4K. But 2K is adequate for any like super zoomed in text work. 2K is adequate. 1440p, which is 2K, is adequate. And for that, the 2080 Ti is supreme. These EVGA GPU cards are, I think, the best in the business. I would choose an EVGA over every other GPU, including ASUS. I guess mainly because my impression is that EVGA is an American-based company, even though the cards may be made in China or Taiwan, just like everything else. But I just like the fact that the EVGA is a USA-based company. So here I'm inserting the antenna mainly for its Bluetooth function, in case I decide to use Bluetooth keyboards, mice, or whatever. It's also nice to know that I could use Wi-Fi if I need to. I use AT&T GigaFiber internet, and I have like an ASUS 5300 router upstairs, and so my Wi-Fi connection speeds are quite good, like almost 600 sometimes. It's like typically more like 500 up, 500 down on Wi-Fi. More than adequate for everything that you can imagine, including like streaming videos or whatever. But I like to hook up my main computer and this computer, which will be behind me, directly via Ethernet into my routers. Thereby I can get 900 speeds up and down. So here I've got it pretty much all put together now. Just doing some last minute checks. Yeah, I've got some frivolous RGB strips on it, but it mainly is useful because it allows me to peer inside the computer during function in case something went amiss. Here I've jumped to, I think I must have missed or accidentally deleted the part of the recording of the first boot up. So I got the posting screen, and I've had a BIOS update on a USB stick that I've stuck in there, and I'm upgrading to, unfortunately here I'm upgrading to a beta BIOS. Later on I'll be downgrading that to the stable version from last fall from the MSI website. But this beta version did have a few flaky problems to it, but it did boot up. Generally works. And so I used it to download or clean install Windows 10 Pro into my new disk. Installing Windows Pro, I think the key points are, at least for me, to always use either SCD keys or VIP. I think the prices with a coupon applied tend to be in the range of like $12, $13 delivered. And the SCD keys especially are consistently, when you buy it as a OEM key, they give you a retail key. A retail key means, in a situation like this where I install my old M2 or drive C boot disk into a new motherboard like this, I can reactivate that retail key. All it takes is an additional step of, when you click into the Windows, it'll ask you, I forget some question, and you click on it, eventually get to a point where it says changed hardware, and you click changed hardware, and it takes you to a setup screen where it allows you to verify that you changed your hardware. You don't have to talk to anyone like the way you used to over the phone. You don't need to beg over the email to, my motherboard burnt up and I bought a new motherboard. Can I reactivate using my same license? And they'll always say yes. Now they have this system where you can just click, change of hardware, and you can just reactivate it. So that's what I'm doing here with a retail Windows Pro key. I had already done that. I think I failed to capture it here, or actually I think I accidentally cut it out from this video. But here, that's my baby 20 years ago. And here I've confirmed the installation, the clean installation of Windows. And so it's just a matter of going in and clicking through, like I like to use Chris Titus's debloat script. Get rid of all the garbage and then just install the programs I need. The programs I need I have on a little Samsung USB 32 gigabyte stick, and I just reinstall here. A reinstallation, clean reinstallation of Windows Pro, and then I just transfer over all my programs. It's essentially just a couple of dozen programs I like to always use, and I put into the Windows 10 startup box. I think they are CPU-Z, GPU-Z, Crystal Disk Mark 8, the HW monitor, the task manager, like a WordPad, my webcam software. I like to use Microsoft Office Word still, 2019. I like to use sync folders to back up. I installed the Windows 10 scanner, DaVinci Resolve, Power DVD. I mean, not for this computer, but my main computer. I'll install like Kindle, voice recorder, alarm clock, control panel, command prompt, like the RGB program, Adobe Lightroom, the Music B, Prime 95, OBS Studio, Chromium ungoogled, my Reolink PC client, the Steam program. I like to install Qubit Torrent, my VPN program, Firefox, Microsoft Edge calculator, and my benchmarking programs, which are Superposition, Prime 95, Cinebench 23, and then I'll install my Precision X1 for my EVGA GPU, MSI Afterburner and Combustor to overclock my GPU. And those are my main programs I like to install. So here I am cleaning up my partitions after I initialized my Crucial P2, as you saw, confirming that I'm formatting, initializing my main C boot disk correctly, and that I've cleaned up all the previous partitions, allocations. Like with the NVMe's, it likes to set aside a portion of the disk so that the whole disk isn't going to be used, because if it is, it dramatically slows down, sometimes up to 90+%, and so you have to set aside a piece of the partition, sometimes 10%, 20% or whatever, something in that range, so that it maintains an optimal speed throughout. So here I've formatted these various things so that I clean it all up and I just do the minimum amount that is required. Just double checking some of them here. Like that recovery partition is from an old one, but whatever. And here, finally, at last, a clean installation of the Windows Pro, which I shall activate using the changed hardware menus from Microsoft Office, Microsoft Windows. So these things tend to go very smoothly nowadays, unlike in the old days when it would glitch and hang up and it didn't give you much indication. It would just freeze and you weren't sure whether it's frozen or it's just taking a long time. But now with these super fast disks, super fast CPUs, it just tends to relatively just zip right through problem free. So in my mind, the Windows operating system, even though it's clunky, is still the superior operating system in 2022 compared to Linux or Mac OS operating systems. The Mac OS systems are really nice to use, usually smooth, usually more problem-free from the user standpoint, but it's so rigid and inflexible in its capabilities that it's very frustrating for people who like things a certain way. So if you like it the way Apple has it set up and you don't mind doing things only as Apple tells you to do, perhaps the Mac OS is the superior system for you. But I think in general, the Windows 10 Pro operating system is superior, subjectively, to me, for me. My very first computer was an Apple II. And I enjoyed that computer so much that my second computer was a Power Mac. And I had like a Mac Power laptop in mid-90s, early 90s, 1992 or so. And I loved that thing, but it was extremely clunky, crashed frequently, was very slow. And then that was around the time period where Apple just went under and became unusable. The company itself became absolutely useless. And that's around the time that the Apple stocks dropped to just pennies, just a few pennies. That was like mid-90s, late 90s. It was prior to Steve Jobs returning to raise it from the dead like a phoenix. But that incompetent prick, I think Gil Amido, was that his name, ran Apple into the dirt around that time. And that's when I abandoned Apple. And Apple came back with Steve Jobs' guidance from the dead, beginning with the Apple iPods, which I enjoyed and even to this day enjoy greatly. And then he parlayed that into the Apple iPhone system, taking cues from the Palm Pilot handspring systems, which incorporated phone calling into their smart PDAs. as well as incorporating the MP3 playing capability of the iPod. And the combination of all that brought us the smartphone as we know it today. Now, my very first smartphone was actually a Palm Pilot system, Corsair. Actually, I owned the Trio, and then eventually the most supreme expression of the Palm Pilot operating system in a smartphone, which was the Corsair, which I owned and enjoyed greatly, prior to jumping to the Motorola Razrs and Samsung Galaxies, which I tried. But the Android operating system for the phone is absolute garbage, absolutely useless for someone who needs the phone function, most important, which is what I did. So when I jumped to the iPhone in early 2000s, maybe it was by 2004 or something, is what I remember, 2005 when I jumped to iPhone. It was so much superior to the Android operating system that to this day I use Apple iPhones. But for a computer, for a PC, I far prefer the Windows environment. The Windows 10 has been for me perfectly adequate in every way. So the Windows operating system just works. I guess eventually I'll be forced into the Windows 11, but I'm going to avoid that for as long as I'm allowed to avoid it. Hopefully in a couple of years the Windows 11 will be fine and it'll work with everything just the way the Windows 10 does. You just have to give it time. Of course, in a couple of years, who knows what's going to happen. It could be an entirely new world of computing. So what's happening here? I'm being asked
Image is steaming now.
to install my Microsoft account. Now, this is one of the things I didn't like about it, is that Windows now pretty much mandates you putting in a PIN, which I strongly prefer not to use. I just like it, at least in my home computers, to be able to just turn on the computer and it's on immediately without a login screen, just like that, what you just saw. But Microsoft will fight you every step of the way to prevent that. So they try to convince you that you need this imaginary cloud of data to sync all your stuff, which you really don't. But ultimately, because of one reason or another, in this instance because I wanted to activate the Windows, I ended up having to log in and thereby comply with the stupid PIN requirement. But normally, if I had a brand new Microsoft activation login, I would set it up so I would never have to put in the PIN.
For over 170 years now, huh?
So now I've got it all set up. So I've brought the computer back to my main desk, and I will now seal it up to complete my project. So most people who are neat freaks would say my build here is just absolutely hideous, ugly, disgusting almost. People who are kind of OCD about it will vomit looking at my build, but to me, I'm not going to be looking at my wires like this. And actually, even if I were, I like it kind of like this, kind of messy and all the wires exposed and kind of bundled like that. I mean, I like it like that. The fan a little bit tilted and off skew like that. I don't care. I like things a bit kind of messy. Well, not messy. I like things a bit real and like that. So it's like the face of Marilyn Monroe's 20-year-old face was too perfect, so having that little mole on one cheek gave that little bit of comfort a bit of humanity to it. In the same way, having a computer that's absolutely immaculate, minimalist, perfect, to me feels cold. So having a few little touches of imperfections, like this tilted fan and kind of messy bundled cables, gives it humanity. So I prefer it like this. So even if it were wide open and like an open rack, I wouldn't mind looking at my computer just like that. But since it's going to be sealed up anyway, who cares what it looks like? No one's going to see it except for me when I take it apart. So now I'm just screwing back in the bottom plate, which allows me to stick the magnetic dust screen over it. Since the GPU fans will be blowing upwards, it will tend to suck in some dust. So having that screen allows me to much more easily kind of pat out dust rather than having all 100% of that dust enter into the computer and into the GPU. So this is more of a practical maintenance issue, putting on the bottom screen and dust filter. Also, I don't like the idea of the potential of cockroaches or crawling bugs entering my computer, because they will do that to seek warmth. I've seen dirty computers, unmaintained, that have had nests of insects built into it. I mean, insects that will kind of squirt their eggs into warm places to allow their brood to mature, and imagine the mess of that. And so it's good to seal up your computer where you can to try to discourage that. And that's another reason why occasionally you have to open it up and blow it all out. Blow and vacuum, blow and suck. And so here, just double checking that nothing's sticking out or dislodged before I pop in all the external plating to the NCase M1 version 6.1 that I have here. Now there is a front plate that I'm leaving uninstalled here. That front plate is useful. Is a useful place to screw in or zip tie in a hard disk drive or whatever else you might want to do, but since I don't need that now, I'm also leaving that plate off. That makes getting into the computer to maintain this and that much easier. So just a matter of knowing where you put that plate. Here I'm just trying to figure out a good piece that will allow the edge of my GPU to rest on it to prevent GPU sag. So I'm just trying various little stanchions for that. You know, I can imagine if I had a 3D printer, I would have some little mini figurine, a gnome or whatever I might like, out of plasticine, printed up That might hold up that edge of the GPU perfectly from the bottom of the NcaseM1 frame. But it's just as easy to just find a little piece of plastic or wood or whatever that might fit right under there. So at last I can seal up the front. Satisfying clicks. The supremely engineered NcaseM1. Behold the perfect finish, the clicks and clacks of its aluminum plates. Beautifully designed. So we're all done here. It's a matter of just sticking it on my rolling cart next to the desk, plugging in the rear PSU power cable, my 3 monitor cables, 2 DisplayPort and HDMI, my audio cable, a couple of USB cables from a keyboard, my mouse, USB dongle, and the computer is ready for action. So thank you for watching and listening as I put together this delightfully enjoyable project, the transmigration of the 9900K Z390 components into my new MSI MPG Z390i gaming edge motherboard placed into my NcaseM1 ITX computer case.